For those of you for whom this may be the first event in this symposium that you are attending, I extend a hearty welcome. For those who have been at earlier sessions, as I have, welcome back. I'm sure you agree with me that the vigor with which our speakers and panelists have debated free speech and its regulation has made this a profound learning experience. This topic could not be more timely. Almost every day we read in the press, and certainly in the higher education trade press, about peer institutions where conflicts have emerged about freedom of expression or academic freedom. And our society is obviously grappling with how to honor our commitment to First Amendment rights in an era of political polarization, and an era with an enormous increase in the speed with which news spreads. I'm proud that we at Kenyon have hosted this symposium, and I thank the many participants who have joined us here in Gambier to engage in this conversation. Here at Kenyon, the faculty have discussed free speech at length over the last year and passed a faculty resolution on freedom of expression in March. At the heart of that resolution, we say the ideas of different members of the college community will quite naturally often conflict, but it is not the proper role of the college to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or offensive. Although the college values civility and encourages all members of the community to maintain a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect should never be used as a justification for limiting discussion of ideas. Before I introduce the speakers in our last panel, Civil Discourse in America, let me take a moment to thank those who made this symposium possible. That includes the funders of the Center for the Study of American Democracy, which include the National Endowment for the Humanities, and those who contributed to match the NEH Challenge Fund grant that allowed us to start this center, and also the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. Andrea Leitner has been the master of logistics for this. Thank you very much, Andrea. Assistant Director Nancy Powers has ably encouraged us all to attend these events. We got a nice crowd here and did a great job chairing yesterday afternoon's panel. Thanks, Nancy. And Tom Karako, the CSAD's director, brought together this formidable array of thinkers from whose insights we have all benefited. Thank you all. Thank you, Tom. And we are very fortunate tonight to have three distinguished panelists to help us assess civil discourse in America and thereby try to pull together the many threads we have learned about over the last day and a half. To my far left, Dr. Howard Dean has had a distinguished career in public service and politics. Governor of Vermont from 1991 to 2003, Governor Dean also chaired the National Governors Association, and after serving as governor, went on to lead to be a leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for president in 2004. He then served as the chair of the Democratic National Committee from 2005 to 2009 and oversaw the party's successful congressional and presidential campaigns of 2006 and 2008. Governor Dean now serves as an MSNBC contributor and serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute. Heather McDonald, in the center, is Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Ms. McDonald is a contributing editor at City Journal and a commentator for CNN and Fox News. Ms. McDonald studied English at Yale and as a Mellon Fellow at Cambridge before taking a law degree at Stanford. She is author of Are Cops Racist? How the War Against the Police Harms Black Americans, which came out in 2010, and the New York Times bestseller, The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe, more recently in 2016. Finally, Steven Pinker is an experimental cognitive psychologist and a popular writer on language, mind, and human nature. A native of Montreal, he earned his bachelor's degree at McGill University and his PhD from Harvard. Professor Pinker has taught at MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, where he's currently the Johnstone Professor of Psychology. Professor Pinker's research on vision, language, and social relations has won prizes from the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Institution of Great Britain, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, the American Psychological Association, and the Association for Psychological Science. His prize-winning books include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and The Sense of Style. Professor Pinker is also the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary and often writes for the New York Times, Time, and other publications. So as you can see, we have a formidable panel. We're looking forward to hearing from them. Let me now ask Tom Karako to take the microphone to moderate this panel. Tom?
Thank you, Joe. I think we've had just a fantastic couple days here. It's been a very lively, a very taut conversation over the last day and a half, and I think folks have been having a lot of fun. This morning, we heard from Allison Stanger from Middlebury, and she had the following observation. She had some great comments, but she had the following observation. She said, you guys have put together this lineup of very interesting and controversial people, some combustible panels, and not a police officer in sight. And you know, that's kind of the idea here is civil discussion, good conversation about some very controversial subjects. We saw that this afternoon with hate speech. We saw this afternoon about a bunch of other things. And it was tense at times, but it was also ultimately always civil. So that's kind of what we've been trying to do here. You've also may have noticed kind of the format. We haven't had a lot of set speeches, and we haven't had a lot of even set panel presentations. We've been deliberately very conversational in both. There's no table here, it's just very conversational. We've had short bios, and we're going to stick to that. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with Dr. Pinker, and we're going to work down the line. And I would just like you to kind of react to how we ought to think about this broad subject of free speech and civil discourse. Your thoughts, bring to bear your research and writing, and tell us some things we ought to think about. And then we'll kick off with the conversation.
Okay. A number of years ago, I wrote in a book that it's no coincidence that freedom of speech was enshrined in the First Amendment of the American Bill of Rights. I thought a fairly unexceptionable statement, but then a historian wrote, and he said, actually, it is a coincidence. Originally, there were 12 amendments. The first two were about congressional pay, and they could never get to an agreement, so freedom of speech was actually in the Third Amendment, but it came the first, which should teach me not to seek numerological significance in anything. But what I should have written is that it is fitting that freedom of speech is enshrined in as the first of the amendments, because it truly is fundamental, and I think it's incumbent of any of us who invokes free speech not to use it as a talisman, as a shibboleth, as just a good thing, but to be able to provide reasons why it is so fundamental. The first of those reasons, I would say, is that it's almost self-evidently a cardinal value, because what you're doing when you argue about free speech or anything is you're presupposing free speech. So if someone were to say, here's why I think that free speech should be abridged, and I immediately shut them up, protest, drag them away, and say, I'm sorry, but your argument is hurtful, it's hate speech, it's a microaggression, so shut up. They would have every right to say, no, 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 you have, hear me out, I have good reasons to oppose free speech, in which case they've just lost the argument. So it's almost a prerequisite to debating anything, including free speech, that there be free speech. Second reason is that there's one thing that we know about the history of ideas, which is that in the past, everyone was wrong about everything, pretty much. People believed that there were unicorns and that the sun revolved around the earth, and that mice were spontaneously generated from piles of straw, and that the cause of illness was foul-smelling air. So we just know that humans are naturally just sinks of error. How do we know more than our ancestors did? Well, there are a number of claimed routes to knowledge which we now know are fallacious, such as authority, scripture, dogma, the feeling of subjective certainty, the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts. So there are many recipes for error, but there is only one generator of truth, other than logical and mathematical truths, but for truths about the world. And that is what the philosopher Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. Namely, you offer hypotheses and you see whether they withstand attempts to falsify them, empirically, but also logically. And that engine of truth accretion can only proceed if there is the ability to propose hypotheses which may be wrong. So the fact that something is wrong cannot be a reason to not allow it to be heard, because it's only the freedom to advance hypotheses, many of which will be wrong, that allows us to approach the truth. A third justification for free speech is that it is truly essential to democracy and to a free society. It's an interesting fact that most authoritarian, thuggish, repressive societies, autocracies, totalitarian dictatorships clamp down on speech. Now, it's not obvious that it'd have to work that way. You could imagine autocrats who feather their nest and suppress any direct claim to threat to their power, but let people complain all they want. But that's not how autocracies work. It is a capital offense, or at least an imprisonable offense, to criticize the government. Now, why in these totalitarian dictatorships? Why should that be true? Well, dictators aren't stupid. They know that people are not deluded about the fact that they are immiserated in these societies. What allows them to maintain their power is that if anyone were to stand up and criticize the authorities, they could pick them off one at a time. If everyone stood up at once, then there's not enough power in any society to keep them down. And that's why the ability to generate common knowledge, that is, not just knowing something, but knowing that other people know it, and knowing that other people know that other people know it, and knowing that other people know that other people know that other people know it, gives people a collective power that allows them to challenge any authority. The paradigm case of this logic being the story of the emperor's new clothes, where when the little boy said the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know. They knew they knew the emperor was naked. They could see it with their own eyeballs. But as soon as the little boy blurted it aloud and everyone heard it in a public place, then everyone knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew, and that allowed them to challenge the emperor with their laughter. A reminder, by the way, of why satire, parody, humor are essential forms of protected speech, because they are often a way to undermine the claims to authority of those in power. Many of us can remember that during the era of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, racists were caricatured as primitive Neanderthals, and supporters of the war in Vietnam were caricatured as bloodthirsty psychopaths. And that rich vein of humor, the Soviet Union also had a rich vein of subversive humor, was one of the weapons in which people defended themselves against the authority of government. Finally, there's a particular imperative, a particular poignancy for the value of free speech on a college campus. Now, universities are expensive luxuries. Parents are paying $250,000. Nonetheless, universities are subsidized by the government. They're given tax breaks. Professors are given the extraordinary perquisite of tenure. Why is there this privileged space carved out for the university? And that's because it is an arena in which we pursue the ideal that disagreements can be resolved through discussion, through conversation, through empirical testing, through logical analysis, through comparison with past ideas, as opposed to charisma, coercion, bribery, beauty contests, and other forms of demagoguery. So it's essential for the privileged role that we carve out for the university that it be an arena in which free speech is encouraged, precisely so that we can identify blunders and errors and evils, expose what's incorrect or what's evil about them, and that this arena be allowed to exercise this one route to finding both empirical truth and, I would add, moral truth. Those are four reasons why we ought to defend free speech when called upon, rather than just asserting that it is a good thing because it sounds good.
Heather, over to you.
Well, let me thank my hosts here. This has been an extraordinary honor, and Professor Karako and Andrea, this is just a pleasure to be among these thinkers. I'm maybe going to suggest the next year's conference topic, which I think is even more important than free speech. The assaults on free speech on college campuses, the attempts to silence nonconforming speech through administrative fiat, brute force, and sometimes actual violence, is a clear betrayal of what the university should stand for and model for the rest of society, which is rational discourse. But that is not the fundamental problem on campuses today. That is an epiphenomenon of what I think is the more important problem, which is the incessant cultivation of a victim mentality. And while I applaud Kenyon's statement of principles, which seems admirable, as long as the victim ideology reigns dominant, the faculty can pass as many paeans to freedom of expression, and it's not going to matter. Now, let me give you my vision of the reality of a university today. There has never been a more liberal, compassionate, and open-minded environment in human history. Traits that for centuries in Western civilization were the target of stigmatization and imprisonment, and that still can lead to stoning or death in other cultures, are actively celebrated on campuses. It's filled with pacific, well-meaning adults who are the least bigoted people in human history and who only wish the best for all of their students. Far from not caring about diversity, there are few faculty searches where the mandate from the dean is not explicit to interview and ideally hire as many females and underrepresented minorities as possible. In student admissions, so fervently does the administration and the faculty desire the presence of diversity on campus that they employ in selective colleges very large racial preferences. We can argue about whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I think it is not doing the alleged beneficiaries any good. The students are the most privileged individuals in human history at any college. They have unfettered access to the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. The Renaissance humanists would have killed for access to this college campus or any other. Every book in human history is available to you. You have scientific laboratories open without constraint. You have magnificent library collections. You have the ability, if you want, to learn languages, to learn history. This is the most privileged position that anyone has ever been in. And to test how valuable it is, there are millions of Chinese students at this very moment who are studying nearly 24 hours a day in order to enter this environment. Now, what I'm sketching out, what I see as the university's reality, is obviously not the dominant narrative today. The dominant narrative on college campuses is that to be a female or to be an underrepresented minority is to be the target of incessant and virtually lethal oppression. During the wave of protests that took college campuses in 2015 in the fall, a group of minority students occupied the provost's office at Brown University and asked to be exempt from traditional academic requirements of showing up in class or doing their exams. Why? Because they said they were fighting to survive. They were fighting for their life at Brown. Now, I posit that that's a delusion. Nevertheless, it's a delusion that is generated by an unholy alliance between students and the growing student services diversity bureaucracy. At Berkeley campus, UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, the Division of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is funded at $20 million a year, the vice chancellor makes $250,000 a year, which is a pittance compared to UCLA's vice chancellor of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, who makes $365,000 a year, which is much more than most faculty make. They have hung, this Berkeley division has hung banners throughout the campus emphasizing the university's paramount mission, which is to assign places in the highly competitive totem pole of victimhood. And a health services person says, I will be a brave and sympathetic ally. Well, we all know this language of allyhood. To need an ally means that it divides the world up into the oppressed, the oppressors, and their allies. And if you're not in the oppressed or the ally category, you're one of the oppressors. One of the banners shows two underrepresented minority students who say, allow others than yourself to exist. Again, I would say that's a delusion. And the adults on campus, to the extent that they cultivate this mentality, are not doing those students any favors, because they are not seeing that they have at their fingertips opportunities to learn and to plunge into real difference, which is studying something other than yourself, to plunge into the past. They will never have that opportunity again. But this view that universities are places of lethal threat is what leads ineluctably to the sense of entitlement to silence non-conforming speech, whether through administrative fiat or through violence. After the Milo riots in Berkeley on February 1st, a bunch of students wrote op-eds in the Berkeley student newspaper justifying the Antifa tactics that rioted both on Berkeley campus and in the city of Berkeley. And they echoed the very language of these banners. Remember, allow others than yourselves to exist. One student said, I was fighting for the right to exist. Somebody else said, again, I was fighting for my life. As long as that sense is dominant, you are going to continue to get the demands to silence non-conforming speech because it is allegedly a threat to a student's identity. I would hope that for once, a college president, when faced with the demands saying, for any Brown student, I don't care if you are purple or green, to not realize that you are privileged to be there and that everybody is supporting your success, and to say that you're fighting to stay alive. For a president to kowtow before that and not say, get a grip. To be an adult means to brush off, to see the difference between real and trivial problems. I would say that most microaggressions are trivial problems. There's Fordham University in New York came out with a list of microaggressions. One of them was being asked, well, what are you? Now, that's really dumb. It's a crude thing to say. But let's admit that in a world where we are told that ethnic identity and racial identity is the prime, most important component of somebody's worth or identity, the person is simply asking about an ethnic identity. So that is not something that I would say should stand in the way of a student's will to ace the chemistry exam. So we should absolutely argue for free speech, but it's going to be a losing battle as long as the victimology ideology reigns as powerfully as it does on college campuses. And I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Great. Well, first let me thank Kenyon. I had the pleasure of sitting in some of the afternoon seminars that were just absolutely incredible and actually very helpful for me as I sort of was thinking about what I was going to say. So this has been an extraordinary effort that the college has put on, and I really appreciate it very, very much. Even those who disagree with me, which I'm going to now get into, because I don't recognize the university that Heather just described, and I teach it at 3 places: Hofstra, which is sort of a commuter college, or was, Yale, and University of Vermont. And I don't recognize the description of a university. I also think non-conforming speech is a very interesting idea. I somehow wonder if some of that is not a synonym for, a polite synonym for hate speech, which is an entirely different problem. However, I am not going to get into the theoretics because the panel that I saw this afternoon was so far above my head in terms of their ability to argue academically about this. I'm going to try to distill this to what I would consider the real world of how this all works. I think I'll tell the story about what happened at Yale 2 years ago. There was a master who I didn't know anything about, and his wife, who were the professor, and his wife was also a professor. And they were also the college leaders at one of the colleges in Yale. And there was a council, I don't know what their function was, I'm a lecturer, I'm not a professor on staff, who sent around a note reminding people not to caricature others based on race or ethnic origin in their Halloween costumes. And the wife of the person who was the co-leader of this college wrote another note, a very widely disseminated emailing, saying, basically, let's not get too politically correct. Don't be a snowflake. Do what you want. You know, you should enjoy your ability to dress up on Halloween, and let's stop all this nonsense. The next thing that happened was there was a 2,000-person protest march. People excused themselves from classes. That's half the student body. They were a hell of a lot better behaved than we were when we were doing that 50 years ago in Vietnam. There was no violence. There was a lot of yelling and some screaming and some people getting very emotional. And ultimately what happened is the professor and his wife resigned as leaders of the college, and they did not resign because they're both tenured as tenured professors. I later found out the leader of the male leader, the husband, was also the leader of the William F. Buckley Society on campus, which I thought was rather fitting. But the reason I'm telling this story is because nobody's attacking the rights of these folks to say political correctness is BS and don't be a snowflake. But there are consequences to free speech. And if you say, I don't think violence is acceptable, period, so let's get that off the table. And I don't defend what happened in Middlebury, although most of the really awful stuff happened from people who came down from Burlington who had nothing to do with the university, and they were not universities or college students. I don't defend the violence, any violence. There wasn't any in this case. But I do defend the notion that ideas have consequences. Being the leader of a college means you're the student advocate. If you choose then to debunk what one group of students felt was protective in their way, you've really kind of lost your purpose to having that job. I thought what that happened, having them moved out of that job was appropriate. Did the guy who got fired from Damore, I think his name was, from Google, for writing that women were biologically inferior and had no chance at being good engineers or whatever he wrote, Did he have a right to say that? Yep, he certainly had a right to say that. It's constitutionally protected speech. Did Google have a right to fire them? Sure did. Core GOP principle. Hiring at will. Guy's bad for business. So, you know, we've had a wonderful argument about the theoretics of free speech. And I do believe that free speech is an incredibly important value just for the students here. And you, after this incredible 2 days, you probably know this already, but this country has the most extreme protections for free speech of any country in the world. We are not, this is not something that, you can be thrown in jail, and people have been thrown in jail for denying the Holocaust in Germany. In Britain, if you say something that somebody deems not very nice, you can get sued, and actually Melania Trump successfully sued, I think, I forget, the Daily Mail, I think, for saying something that was grossly not true and defamatory for £1.5 million, and won. That wouldn't happen here. We have libel laws that are influenced by our desire for free speech that are very, very powerful. You can say almost anything you want about a public figure and you can't be successfully sued. But there are consequences. So we have an extreme version of free speech, which for the most part I support. But speech has consequences. I'm interested in exploring, and now, so there's these court cases, and so the point was made this afternoon that 9-0, this defense of free speech is not uncommon and has been for quite a while, except for the Chaplinsky case, which we can get into, which I think is a lot of fun. But while we have both the academic and the judicial loyalty to free speech, we have to, that's not what all free speech is about. I want to bring this down away from the argument about perfection and academia and even legal consequences to what happens every day. There are very few cases where free speech is violated that end up in the courts. It's adjudicated somehow. I asked the president of the university at dinner tonight, the college tonight, what would you do if you came out one morning and saw a Nazi flag and planted it in the courtyard? What would you do? And before I made him painfully answer the question, which I knew this is not a question, you have to think about the answer to this. And I said, inevitably somebody would rip it down. What would be your reaction to somebody ripping down what might be arguably protected speech? And if this were to be a pattern and Nazi flags were left in the courtyard for a long period of time, how long do you think you'd have your job? What would the trustees say? These are the kinds of real life things, and they get resolved in ways that we might not like as purists about free speech. What would most likely happen is the flag would go up, it might stay for a short time, then it would come down. There happens to be a rule against having objects that are not sanctioned by the university placed on the green. This is how most of these cases are resolved. They don't get to court. They get resolved by practical people. One of the most fascinating questions that did not get answered in this unbelievably great panel I saw this afternoon is, who is to say? And on that argument founders all the theoretical objections to free speech. Because unless you say, who is to say, once you name who is to say, then free speech is no longer free speech. Because the real purpose of free speech, which is what the founders put in the Constitution for, is to make sure that authoritarianism does not reside in a single person. That's what this country was founded on, with the notion of King George in the back of everybody's head as they were busy writing all these documents. But on a practical level, somebody does in fact have to decide whether a Nazi flag goes up, whether you want to spend $1 million so that some psychologically deranged person who is a provocateur, not just somebody who has a point of view that's noxious, but is there for the sole purpose of provoking, whether you should spend $1 million making sure they have security so there's not a riot. Those are real-life discussions and real-life decisions that bring this out of the realm of academia and out of the realm of theoretical legal thing, and dumb down the question to a practical level which everybody actually has to live with. My attitude, so let me pose a few questions and then I'm going to shut up temporarily. If you have somebody who is preaching Nazism as a result of the invitation of the university, is it not free speech to make so much noise shouting back at them and nobody can hear? Is that not free speech? Something to be considered. If you have someone who has threatened to come to your university in California, where there are a lot of people who fit this description, and name every undocumented student there in the presence of an INS agent who he has invited, is that free speech? And if so, what should the rest of the resolution be? Was it fair for James Damore to be fired from Google? Was that an infringement on his free speech? Because it certainly would have been bad for Google to keep him there. I don't do business with Hobby Lobby. I won't, because of what the birth control decision that the Supreme Court made. I have a list of people that I don't do business with. I don't buy ExxonMobil gas unless I run out in the middle of the night. I'm not so stupid as to. But I don't buy it because when Exxon took over Mobil was a fairly progressive company and had same-sex benefits in it, and Exxon stripped them of them. So I don't buy New Balance shoes. They're fantastic shoes made in America. The chairman of the company gives large amounts of money to right-wing causes. So I found another brand of American shoes. Now, that's fine, that doesn't bother New Balance anymore, but if 10,000 people all agreed that is that an infringement on the founder's free speech? If it is, do we have the right to express our opinion by not subsidizing his speech? These are all very complicated, interesting questions that are beyond the theoretical. These are the kinds of free speech questions that you're going to have to deal with every single day in your lifetime.
So I think I counted about 17 eggs that were just laid on the table over the course of the last week. I can egg you on against each other, but I want to see if you all would like to jump on some of the many things that you each have just raised and respond to.
Well, you bring up the Yale case. That's a very concrete case as opposed to some of the hypotheticals about Nazi flags. Let's look at that a little more closely, because I think it also supports some of my arguments. The memo that was written, the email to Silliman College from Erica Christiakis, the wife of the college master, suggested that students did not need the campus diversity bureaucrats to police their Halloween costume choices. And she was arguing about child psychology and the sort of the need sometimes to be transgressive. So it was a fairly academic treatment of the matter. What followed upon that, and we know this thanks to FIRE that published some of the videos that Greg Lukianoff took, was the husband of Erica Christiakis, the master of Silliman, was surrounded by a group of students who hectored him for hours and screamed at him. There was one girl who cursed at him, "You have no effing right to be here. Why are you here? You are assaulting us." Another student got right into this professor's face and challenged him physically. And I would say that if students feel like they are under, again, existential threat from somebody writing a memo taking issue with a typical bureaucratic product of the diversity bureaucracy, if that person feels like he or she is unable to get a Yale education, that is a mistake. That is really losing perspective on the unbelievable resources you have at Yale. You have Sterling Library, you have Beinecke Library, you have the Science Center. This should not be an impediment. But as long as we keep telling students that even though they're in the most educationally endowed university among all the world, that they somehow can't learn because of a memo, that is a problem. And unfortunately, Yale's president, Peter Salovey, rather than saying, "Get a grip," he pandered. He wrote a college letter that said, "I have never been so moved by the courage of students in my life." He allowed the Christiakises to basically twist in the wind, They too wrote a penitential letter. I do not think that that is an instance of hate speech. And I think that the very category, as it's been used today, is extraordinarily expansive and is fundamentally ideological. And it is a way of stigmatizing against certain views that go against the reigning thought world on college campuses.
Just a brief connection. I didn't say that was hate speech. I didn't use that as an example of hate speech.
I guess I'd like to express some respectful disagreement with Governor Dean over the Google memo, because Jamie Damore did not say that women were biologically inferior. Right. I mean, only a madman could say that, and Jamie Damore was a smart guy. What he did say was that since we don't know that men and women are indistinguishable in every psychological aspect, and of which ability was actually not even highlighted in the memo. He talked about differences in life priorities, differences in values, that as long as there could be differences between the sexes, we can't use differences in representation, that is something short of exact 50-50, as proof of discrimination, and that it's unfair to hold Google employees under a implicit accusation of sexism simply because the ratio isn't 50-50. Now, Damore is correct. That is a logically impeccable argument. It is unexceptionable among labor economists that you cannot establish discrimination by a statistical distribution that differs from that of the population, because there are so many ways in which groups of people can differ from one another. Moreover, the studies that he cited, mainly about differences in variance, not about differences in mean, were actually a pretty good reflection of the literature. One could, as with any academic subject in the social sciences, there can be controversy and different readings of the evidence. But he certainly, everything that he said in the memo was at the very least defensible, had been said by academics in peer-reviewed journals, and by no means was it a sexist or an outrageous document. Now, of course, it's just true that Google has the right to fire him. That does raise important questions about Google's commitment to the dissemination of information, and given that they are the largest entity on the planet that controls dissemination of information, I think it raises important questions about potential bias in search engine results, if that's their internal policy. But I think more perniciously, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, there are people who read the memo, many of whom would read it and say, well, this seems actually perfectly reasonable, and they would be correct. It was more or less reasonable. There are things that I disagreed with, but it's still it was an intelligent document. If you are telling people that this kind of something that they can see with their own eyes, and leading to think this is unacceptable, you will be, in the mainstream of academia and tech, you will be punished, you will be silenced, well, that kind of sets an opening for people to drift toward anything they see as the alternative to what they perceive as a stifling politically correct consensus. And I don't have to remind people that the result is that people could vote for a candidate who has very little to recommend him other than that he hates the politically correct consensus. And I was stunned by the number of people who supported Donald Trump, who I had previously thought were intelligent, reasonable people, who glommed onto him simply because they were so disgusted with the politically correct consensus that they would vote for anyone who opposed them. So even if, like myself, you're appalled, horrified by the results of the election last November, that's all the more reason to make sure that we don't set up academia and information technology as an institution that's perceived as so oppressive that people will react to it. We can't be less intelligent, less open to argument, less reasonable, less rational than Donald Trump.
So let me defend Google a little bit. I'd love the reaction of both of you to this one. Let's just assume that Stephen is correct and that there was actually some academic substance to Damore's comments, which there may or may not have been, but let's just assume for the moment that that's correct. I think he was also a victim of context, because there's not a lot of question that the culture in Silicon Valley is male-dominated and that women do not get paid the same amount for the same amount of work, that they are underrepresented in many of these very large companies. There is a very strong component of sexual harassment, particularly by male investors towards those women who are trying to do startups. So one of the interesting things, which is, it's not so much a free speech issue, although it obviously touches on this, which is why I'd love to get your views on it. So along comes Jamie Damore, and he writes this, I thought, fairly scatological analysis of why women couldn't be as good engineers as men. In the context of what else was going on in Silicon Valley, this blows the place up. And it may be that if that context didn't exist, or at least that many of the women employees in Silicon Valley didn't feel like it existed, which is a fairly uniform feeling in Silicon Valley, and I know a lot about Silicon Valley because I raise a lot of money there for a variety of causes. So in some ways, one might argue that he was a victim of saying the wrong thing, or maybe even the right thing, at the wrong time. I find that interesting. The question is, does Google have an obligation to be the referee for free speech? We acknowledge that the president of the college has an obligation at the end of the day to make determinations about what's free speech, what's protected speech, and what's not, to the best of his ability in this circumstance, because not every case is going to go to court, which is right. But does every business have an obligation to decide when free speech is hurting their business and what they should do about it?
There's something I have to respond to. He did not. He absolutely did not say that women are not as good engineers as men. He just said that there may not be a 50-50 ratio to women. He did not say that women who are engineers are inferior compared to men. And that's a very, very important distinction.
He said it was more difficult for women to become engineers because they didn't have the same aptitude for men as a group.
No, he didn't. He said he actually did not. You know, we heard mentioned today about Larry Summers, who was addressing the underrepresentation of females in the STEM fields. And Summers did talk about the tails of the curve on math skills and pointed out that males are in the extreme bad end, incompetent end of math skills, but they also dominate the far end. And women are strong in math, but they are not as far, they're not as awful as some men are, and they're not the absolute cutting edge. And that, again, I would argue that was a reasonable hypothesis to put forward, among others, as Summers did, for why there may not be 50-50 representation in the STEM fields, and not grounds for removal as college president. But Damore wasn't even arguing that with regards to the distribution of highest level math skills. He was talking about interests and was talking about the psychology of males and females. He used a term that struck everybody, I think, whoa, this is a strong, and he talked about women being more neurotic. But that's actually just a phrase in psychology to name a particular type of trait of being more risk averse and more conscious of risk. And he talked about some women are more interested in people rather than ideas. So it had said nothing about their capacity, those that were interested in science and in programming and abstraction, to compete. As far as whether Google has any kind of First Amendment obligations, I agree with you completely that the employer has a contract at will and can get rid of him. I would say the question is, what does that do, though, for the climate of discourse on at Silicon Valley generally?
Can I pause this? I feel like we might be getting a little bit in the weeds on some of the, whether it's Yale or Google. And maybe we draw back a little bit. Let me go back to some of the things you were saying, Governor Dean, about free speech and hate speech. Let's go back to the Constitution for a minute. You've said in the past that hate speech is not protected by the Constitution. I wonder if you, and you also emphasized this just now about kind of just the pragmatic and the politics. You drew on the discussion from this afternoon about who gets to decide. And so let me pose to you again the question, is hate speech protected by the Constitution? And to throw back that question, who gets to decide what it is?
Well, the Supreme Court of the United States gets to decide in the abstract, but those decisions are made every day because I would say 99.999% of situations never get to the Supreme Court. So they give broad guidelines, which some people are inclined to respect more than others. I got in a lot of trouble for tweeting that hate speech was not protected in the Constitution. There is one case in 1942 that says it's not. And then there's the fighting words case. Is hate speech fighting words? I find that to be very interesting. And that was the Chaplinsky case. I would argue that hate speech is fighting words because look what happens in places like Berkeley when somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos comes to town. But, maybe we could have other arguments. I do think that, I have to confess to have backed off some in saying all hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. I think that hate speech, which is an incitement to violence, is clearly, and I don't think anybody would disagree with me, is clearly not protected by the First Amendment. And then the question is, what hate speech is incitement to violence? And I think that's very, very difficult to decide. So this is not going to be an easy question. And I tend to favor as free a speech as possible because I think that's the essence of what may end up being the most important barrier to authoritarianism in our history. But I do think there is a limit. And there is a limit, even in the most extreme form that we have here. As we used to say in school, the right for me to swing my fist ends at the end of your nose, about a quarter inch short of your nose. But even that is an exaggeration because that would be deemed to be threatening. So it's a bit of a circuitous answer because it's like everything else we've talked about for 2 days. There are no really clear lines, unless because even the Constitution clearly does not absolutely protect all speech.
Go ahead.
Well, I just think that as the sense of victimhood grows, the definition of hate speech grows more and more. And I think things are being called hate speech, which I think is ludicrous. And I don't want to personalize this because I really am against the sort of narcissism of identity politics, but I'll have to say a speech I was supposed to give at Claremont McKenna College in California was blockaded by students, so nobody could get in to hear me because the argument is that I was, again, a lethal threat to students and perpetrating hate speech. What was I going to talk about? I was going to report my experience attending police community meetings in high crime neighborhoods across the country and give a slightly different take on policing than is dominant in our politics today. It was a report on a massive degree of support for the police among the thousands of law-abiding residents there. And I was going to use Bureau of Justice Statistics data, this is our premier criminal justice agency in the federal government, on crime and police shootings, to challenge the dominant narrative that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black males. And I was going to provide facts. Now that's viewed as hate speech. And the students, I was, called a racist, transphobe, homophobe, queerphobe, misogynist, you name it. Now, if somebody cannot present an alternative set of facts without being silenced, and the students made sure that nobody could get in that hall to hear me, I think we have gone beyond sort of law school hypotheticals about a Nazi flag, and we're dealing with something that, again, is too unmoored from reality and is based on a ideology of certain groups of students on campus being at mortal risk for their lives, and I think that is a delusion.
Stephen, can I direct this to you in terms of actually something that you were discussing this afternoon at another panel, and that's, again, the category of hate speech and the issue of microaggressions. I wonder if you might just go.
Although I think we all agree with Governor Dean that there are limits, and the Supreme Court has ruled that there are limits, including incitement to imminent lawless activity. I don't know if that's the exact wording. And I think we can all agree that those are reasonable, but they do have to be defined very narrowly because they can very easily creep outward to criminalize any speech you don't agree with. And there are many examples. Heather gave one in which her perfectly reasonable, evidence-based, contrarian analysis of policing was suppressed by violence, a message that very much ought to be heard. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which was mentioned today, is a McCarthyite organization that has a list of supposed proponents of hate speech, which include Ayaan Hirsi Ali, one of the great heroes of our age, Linda Gottfredson, a brilliant psychologist because she believes that there is a heritable component to IQ. She's right, there is a heritable component to IQ. So people are being accused of hate speech who say things that are ought to be heard and that very often are true. Going back to the original context of the cliche that almost everyone invokes in terms of legitimate restrictions on free speech, from Oliver Wendell Holmes, namely it does not include the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. Now, those of you who know that particular case might remember what the context was. What was his example of shouting fire in a crowded theater? Opposing American involvement in World War I. Or was it opposing conscription or American involvement? Now this, according to Holmes, was shouting fire in a crowded theater, and people who argued against the US involvement in World War I were thrown in jail. I mean, in England too, Bertrand Russell, I believe, was thrown in jail. Nowadays we see this as horrific, that it's perfectly legitimate to criticize your government's involvement in a war. In fact, it's in many cases morally mandatory. That's certainly what many people thought during the era of the Vietnam War. But it was criminalized, and it was criminalized under the justification of shouting fire in a crowded theater. So yes, I think it is possible to hold someone responsible for egging a crowd on to start an ethnic pogrom or to lynch someone. I think that can be criminalized. But the burden of proof ought to be on anyone who invokes that restriction on free speech, since it is so easily expanded to criminalize any speech that you don't agree with.
So can I shift this now kind of from the free speech and the legal side to the civil discourse? And I guess it's cultural or something like that. And maybe the bridge from the one to the other. I think of the Federalist Papers, and I think it's Federalist 55, and I think it's Hamilton that says, you know, there's a degree of depravity in human nature, but there's also a degree of esteem and all these other good qualities. And he says, and Republican government requires the latter in a greater degree than any other form. And so, you know, frequently when we talk about this civil discourse, we expect qualities, character in the American people, right? And I think a lot of this discussion is out of kind of presupposing or maybe having doubts about our ability to discuss things with each other in a virtuous, you know, thoughtful, deliberative way. So let me move from law to this other thing, call it culture, whatever else. If we want this, if we want the civil discourse stuff, how do we get there? It surely can't just be about the law. Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I would say, to bring it back to the university, that for a start, when there are attempts to blockade speakers or use violence, where's the faculty? They enjoy tenure to protect their own freedom of speech, but they should be out there with their bodies making sure that students have the choice to hear who they want to hear, and support that value of speech and live it. It's the most remarkable irony, and I can't believe they get away with it, that Antifa gets to call itself anti-fascist. Anybody that can see windows being broken and perceived opponents being clubbed or maced without worrying that we are heading down a slope that is always a risk. We cannot assume our level of civil harmony right now. We could go back to a world where force rules. How can Antifa get away with calling itself anti-fascist? They are the ones that routinely engage in the paramount fascist behavior, which is silencing through force or violence speech that they disagree with. So, although I said, you know, the faculty statements they're good, but it's not enough. You have to counter the ideology of victimhood. I think maybe the faculty also, at events like this, have to be more active. There's a current example as well that I would say that shows how extreme the hate speech categories become. There's two faculty members at University of Pennsylvania Law School, Amy Wax, and a law professor at University of San Diego, who wrote an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer calling for a revival of traditional bourgeois values, of hard work, deferred gratification, staying away from drugs, waiting until you're married to have kids. They have been the target of endless attacks to prevent them from teaching first-year students. Their deans have, while paying lip service to free speech, have assiduously denounced their views. There was a group of faculty at the University of San Diego who wrote a letter pushing back against their own dean's craven capitulation to the mob. But at Philadelphia, at UPenn Law School, half the faculty have signed a petition against Amy Wax, which is appalling, but the other faculty are silent. They have to start speaking up.
Well, Governor Dean Stephen, I wonder if you could also weigh in on the civil discourse. How do we get back to more civil discussions? I'm thinking politically as a nation, not merely on campuses.
Well, my theory on this one is that my generation has to get the hell out of politics and let the first global generation take over. My experience with this young generation, which my children are in the forefront of, being 10 years older than most of or a little more than that, students here, is that students actually treat each other with a fair amount of respect. That people do. There's a much less ideological bandwidth in this group. You don't have as many right-wingers, a few outliers, of course, and not as many left-wingers. That you actually economically agree with liberalism, libertarianism. You're more libertarian than the left wing of the Democratic Party. But on social issues and tolerance and issues that you are with the Democrats, which is why you vote 58 to 60% with us, and why you elected Barack Obama President of the United States, the only election in my lifetime where more people under 35 voted than over 65. So what I'm hoping is that we're a very polarized generation. This started in Vietnam, and it went downhill from there. And you know, this is the culture wars. I don't think there's any, I think Amy Wax was wrong. I didn't read the editorial, but I disagree with what she said.
You haven't read the editorial?
I do. I don't think she should be banned from the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania for saying it, but I don't agree with that. I just am, I just have different views because I've met a lot of different kinds of people in my life, and I don't judge them for the choices they make, which I think is somewhat of a hallmark of this young generation. And I think the problem is that we've resorted to worse and worse toxicity, and I have my ideas of who's to blame, but I don't want to hear Heather's, so I'm not going to tell her mine. But the truth is my generation is going to go to the grave engaged in these culture wars, and I think the only way to get by that is to get your generation into politics. The only problem is your generation isn't interested in institutions. It's not terribly, it's not really affiliated with any party. You may vote for Democrats, but you're not Democratic or Democrats. And so the real problem is getting you to understand that institutions are essential for building anything that's going to outlast your particular interests. This is a whole different talk, which I don't want to spend everybody's time on. But I think the solution to all this is to get us the hell out of politics and get you into politics, and that's going to take some work.
Well, I will let Stephen weigh in on the civil discourse side, and really while he's doing that, after this we're going to open up to questions from the audience, so feel free to go ahead and line up at the microphones, and we'll have an exchange with the panelists.
So the first half of the topic for today's symposium was free speech, and the second one was civil discourse. So I think the first, free speech, as far as I'm concerned, is a really easy issue. Civil discourse is much, much harder, because if hate speech is subjective, civility surely is subjective. There is a lot of political opposition that has been raucous, rude, puerile, that we are grateful for in retrospect. And I believe the Supreme Court has ruled that that offensive speech is protected. And there, in fact, there was a case of a man who wore a T-shirt in the courtroom that said, "Fuck the draft." And that was protected. He was arrested, tried in the Supreme Court. My memory is, legal scholars can correct me, that the Supreme Court ruled that that is protected speech. Now, that is not particularly civil. It's puerile, it's stupid, it's not really a very good argument against the draft. But history has shown that very often movements that we are grateful for in retrospect had their rude and raucous fringe. And so we certainly don't want to clamp down on it with violence or with legal restrictions. On the other hand, for progress to happen, it really has to be propelled by respectful civil disagreement, open debate. That's really why we really want free speech, so that that kind of discourse can occur. And it is not trivial to know how to encourage it, particularly in the current environment. Certainly what we are seeing of the increased polarization, where the right and the left are each more convinced that the other side is stupid and evil, that issues that formerly were fairly depoliticized, like climate change, is now just a strict litmus test on right-wing versus left-wing ideology. Many studies have shown that people who deny man-made climate change are no more scientifically illiterate than people who support it. The only difference is political affiliation. If you're on the right, you don't believe it. If you're on the left, you do. That makes it really essential that we try to, and I don't know how, other than most persuasive arguments possible, that we try to depoliticize issues, to change the norms so that you're considered foolish and idiotic if you simply repeat a right-wing or left-wing dogma, that what ought to gain you respect is an ability to marshal arguments and evidence for a position. All the more reason that free speech not be identified as a right-wing issue. I think that would be I think that's quite a pernicious tendency, nor that it be identified with a kind of old person baby boomer position, because as Howard has mentioned, as Heather has mentioned, it's really not the millennials who are to blame for illiberal currents on campus. It's really our generation. For one thing, as Governor Dean said, we were much worse in the 60s in terms of toleration of violence, in terms of incivility, in terms of illiberal tendencies. And now we're in power. We run these colleges and universities, and it's our generation's spinelessness and lack of commitment to free speech that has not only opened a space, but in some cases actively encouraged the repression of unorthodox opinions. So anyway, free speech should not, as much as we can, be depoliticized and unlinked from generations.
All right, well, so this is your opportunity to ask some questions of these three very thoughtful national voices. So just come on up to the microphones and we'll take you in order. No? All right, we'll start over here. Yes, sir.
I'd like to get back into the weeds on Yale for a second, if possible. I found that particular incident so perplexing. So many of these incidents, I've disagreed with, but I understand where they're coming from. And this one was just different to me. I went to school here a number of years ago, and Halloween was a big deal. Nobody was careful with almost no one was careful about their Halloween costumes, and the messaging implied it, and that's leaving aside, shock your mom completely. And when the incident happened, I was teaching at Ohio University, where Halloween is a kind of a deity. And what perplexed me, it made me notice two things. One was that for the first time, I saw students emphatically taking the position of regulate us, right? Limit us. You know, we're in favor of these restrictions that were included in the original memo. And the other thing it made me notice was that a lot of these incidents, Berkeley, Yale, Middlebury, happen in the very, very elite learning institutions and places of, you know, acute privilege. And yeah, anything about that, because I thought that the letter wasn't really Buckley-esque, but what it did was say, we've done our best to create inclusive and safe spaces in classrooms and in dorm life, and do we need to take this next step? So anything about those?
So let me just respond. First of all, I don't think the students were asking to be regulated. What they were objecting to is a senior person who was literally meant to be their guardian, which was the role of a college leader. Now, it used to, at that time, it was called college master. It's now called college leader. What they objected to, I mean, look, the stereotypes of Halloween costumes are hurtful. When I first came to Vermont, there was something called the cakewalk, which was where white students would dress up in blackface and imitate African-American show business people from the era of Step and Fetch It. They got rid of it for what I thought were pretty obvious reasons. So when you put on a Halloween costume that exaggerates ethnic stereotypes, it's pretty offensive to people who happen to be of that ethnicity. So what the council said in their memo was, they didn't say don't do it. They said we recommend that you not do this and that you have consideration for your fellow students who may not share your ethnicity and may have a different view of this. And what Elena wrote in her memo was, basically, let's not get too serious about Halloween, go out and have a great time. That's what this is really all about. And that's what the spark was, because there were, one of the things about this generation which I find so interesting is diversity is a very high value in this generation, a very high value. They pride themselves on diversity. And I think you've got this enormous reaction, not just among students of various minority groups, but of white students in solidarity with each other. Look, when half the student body goes out and actually a very well-behaved march and protest, it probably tells you something about the culture of the university. And I don't, you know, that's what happened. Now, I will have some differences with Heather about her description. It is true that one girl lost it. I knew a lot of people who knew her. I didn't know her personally. She was very embarrassed about it. She blew up. She lost it. She was 20 years old. You know, the master is, you know, an adult. I think sometimes you have to excuse young people for doing stupid stuff, because young people do stupid stuff. That's sort of old people, but young people should be given a little more rope than somebody who my age who had a temper tantrum. But that's basically, no, I mean, she was very apologetic and embarrassed about it, and ultimately I think she apologized. But you know, that's how the students at Yale looked at it. They looked at it as an attack on all of them, not just the members of the minority groups that are likely to feel offended. And they were not asking for regulation. They were asking for respect for the people who had suggested this, and that they felt they didn't get.
Well, you asked about how do we foster civil discourse. I'm not aware of the student apologizing. Greg would probably know that. I'm also not aware of any reprimand of her. Her behavior was absolutely appalling towards an adult, and I do not think that somebody's age as a young student justifies the type of language and screaming at an adult figure. 50 years ago, that would have definitely merited some sort of reprimand from the college, and instead, as I understand it, she was held completely harmless. This is actually not the first time, though, that students ask to be regulated. I would say, to return to the topic that Laura Kipnis was talking about today, we have the bizarre situation on college campuses where students are actually demanding that bureaucrats write rules for sex. Are you kidding me? Sex is the very realm of the irrational and the chthonic. And if you don't understand that, read Boccaccio or Ovid.
Obviously.
And if they're even allowed to be taught anymore, I don't know.
Well, it's a hell of a lot more fun than the First Amendment, isn't it?
But this is a very curious thing. The idea that some bureaucrat is going to write rules for consent is a very strange situation. And there is now a codependency between students and the diversity bureaucrats or the Title IX bureaucrats that students act out little psychodramas of oppression before an appreciative audience of diversity bureaucrats who then say, aha, we need more grounds to expand our realm. We need more diversity bureaucrats. And it's a completely closed loop of codependency. So I think that this is becoming a strong distraction from really what should be the primary role of education, which is to get knowledge into students' heads.
I'd agree that it makes sense to come to terms with a mistake that a young person makes or an overreaction that a young person makes. But I think that in large part that was somewhat the point of the letter that went out in the first place.
Well, I would just say, for the record, we did all those things 50 years ago when we were on campus, and we told the president of the university to F himself, and nothing ever happened. And I'm not in favor of this. Armed students went into the president of the university's office in Cornell, and none of them got expelled. With, I mean, things have definitely improved. Steve, this is why I'm a huge fan of Stephen. I think you all want to read The Better Angels of Our Nature. If you think you have it bad, I'm not denigrating you, but boy, things were a lot worse 50 years ago.
We've got a lot of folks in line. I really want to make sure everybody gets a chance. Stephen, do you want to weigh in quickly?
I think Heather correctly identified a problem that goes beyond free speech, which is that university bureaucracies have massively expanded their power in many realms. Speech codes are one of them, but also human subjects research, Title IX, as Laura Kipnis informed us before. And that itself is a problem in university governance, that a self-sustaining bureaucracy responsible to no one exerts enormous power. I think we should, there is a danger in assuming that the way to make the world a better place is to accuse more and more and more people of being racist, sexist, and homophobic who are not racist, sexist, and homophobic. That not only is there plenty of genuine racism and sexism and homophobia to combat, so that diffusing energy so that anyone who inadvertently says anything that could be conceivably construed as prejudicial gets tarred as a racist, not only diverts energy from where it ought to belong, but it does create a reaction, and to put it bluntly, it sends people into the arms of Donald Trump. I mean, it just does.
So we have 9 people in line. I am going to violate your rule. Let's take a couple questions here. Okay. Right here and then right here in quick order.
Okay. This is a corollary question to, I think, the idea of free speech, which is the idea that in recent times we have more ability than ever to cut ourselves off from the opinions of people who we disagree with. And I say this as a person who grew up in Arkansas and so has this huge, I mean, I feel like it's almost 2 different worlds between Kenyon and where I come from, as someone who more agrees with Kenyon, and so I am myself at fault of the same thing, which I'm asking about.
And let's go ahead and take it over here.
Right. I'd actually like to challenge Ms. McDonald on one of her points. One of your points is that a lot of these people who are, coming to campuses and expressing different, maybe a little less accepted views, should be, they should have the right to go and say these things, even if they're a little off the field from what we expect. But I would argue is that while that works, while that argument is good in theory, it's not the context of what's going on. From what I've seen, the majority, not all, but the majority of speakers who get blocked from going to campus are people who have said genuinely hurtful things and have done genuinely hurtful things. Like we talk about Milo Yiannopoulos a lot. In one speech, he actively outed a trans student who was at that school and made disparaging remarks about her as a way of attacking the fact that she was a trans student. And Ann Coulter, who is another person who was blocked from speaking, has pretty much, in my opinion, made a career out of attacking people based on their race or their religion. So I would argue that in the context of what the situation is around the campus, more often than not, speakers who get blocked are people who have said genuinely hurtful things, who have said genuinely threatening things in terms of attacking people. And I would argue that while we can argue about the specifics of, the violence wasn't okay, but I would argue that it really wouldn't be the best idea for them to speak in that way. And I would argue that free speech does not genuinely cover that sort of thing.
Quick responses to either of those, both of those?
Free speech absolutely does cover hurtful speech. You do not have the right not to be hurt. Because arguments against the Vietnam War, arguments against the draft, arguments against World War I, arguments against slavery were hurtful to many people in that era, and it's a good thing their feelings were hurt. They were wrong. Their feelings should have been hurt. Now, this doesn't mean that anyone who hurts someone's feelings is right. Most people are wrong, but the Supreme Court has ruled, and I completely agree, that there is no protection against hurtful speech. That having been said, I think it's I think it's unwise. I think it's idiotic to invite Milo Yiannopoulos to campus, not because what he says is offensive, which it is, but he is not a scholar. He does not meet the standards of ordinary debate and discourse that we expect at a college campus. However, I'm not sure about your tabulation that most of the controversial speakers fall into that category. I mean, you may have a list, I haven't seen one, but remember that there have been violent protests against Heather McDonald, against Charles Murray, against a number of people who are entirely scholarly, evidence-based, simply based on the content of their speech. So yes, we don't have to invite Milo to campus, but an overly broad restriction means that we don't get to hear Heather McDonald.
Anybody else? Okay. So why don't we take the next two? Next person in line in both lines.
So my question draws on a point that Stephen made about baby boomers being responsible for
Can you speak?
Yeah, baby boomers being responsible for many of the issues that we face today, and I certainly agree with that. It sometimes feels like you guys, it's like a case of arrested development, and that you guys never got over that psychic shock that you experienced whenever you were young. But regardless, so we have to live with the problems that you made for us. So how do we undo and correct the damage done by your generation? How do we undo and correct the damage done by your generation?
All right, wow, that's fun. Right over here.
I'm a little tall for this mic, but my question is about the difference. My question is about the difference between free speech and civil discourse, emphasis on the word civil, which implies the lack of physical violence. And some free speech actually condones violence and even incites violence against people. For instance, if we allow police officers to unrightfully murder black men in this country without any ramifications, without any consequences, is one example. Another example is, as an American Jew, when my president does not call out domestic terrorism for what it is, I'm referring to Charlottesville, that is speech that is directly inciting violence, and actually like supports the intended physical harm or death upon fellow citizens. And I believe that like as the government of the United States has an obligation to protect to protect the lives of its citizens, and by protecting speech that incites violence and harms and might harm its citizens, in my mind, that's the difference between free speech and having a civil discourse. I'm all for having all view. Well, there's a.
Let's put a question mark on it. Okay, can I maybe direct the police officer point to Heather, and then the baby boomer, whoever wants to take that?
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether to address the substance of the charge or the speech aspect. I'm not sure that I see the police shootings of civilians as a speech issue. I don't think anybody's advocating that. You allege that there is a specific lack of accountability for police shootings of black civilians. If that were the case, that would be an utter travesty in our criminal justice system and a betrayal of our fundamental civil rights. The data that I've got from Philip Stinson that looks at convictions of officers since 2005 for killing civilians shows that the vast majority of victims of officers who were convicted were black, not white. So one can argue whether there's been enough convictions. It is certainly the case that juries do tend to give the benefit of the doubt to officers in split-second, excruciatingly difficult shoot-don't-shoot decisions. And maybe they should not be granted that benefit of the doubt. But I don't see this as necessarily a speech issue because nobody is advocating the unjustified use of force against civilians, black or white. And I would just say, as a general matter, as a footnote here, the data also does not show that there is an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black males generally. The data does not show that, and 4 studies came out last year alone. As impossible as this is to understand, because it's so contrary to what we think we know about police shootings, that if there is a bias in police shootings, it's against whites. And I'm going to have to ask you to take it on faith without seeing the studies, but they are out there, and I can give you the data.
So how do you fix the problems with baby boomers?
Okay, I'll take that one. I do have to say there has been one well-publicized, very public official who did advocate police violence, and that was the president when he said, don't be so soft with these guys. Give them a good whack when you put them in the car, bang their head against the roof. You know, when you have the president of the United States doing that, kind of sets a tone. Okay, you're in trouble because we made lots of problems. We also gave you a civil rights movement which is not completed, but which enormous progress has been made. And the reason that you value diversity and inclusion and gay rights is because that's what we taught you as parents. So now I will.
I love my baby boomer dad.
And so I will cop to, we're going to leave you with a lot of problems. Guess what? You're going to have kids. You're going to leave them with a lot of problems. This is the way of the world, so get used to it.
All right, so let's take another 2. Keep it rolling here. One here, one here.
Ms. McDonald, I had a specific question for you. You said something that was striking to me about how faculty must speak up on college campuses, about how faculty have an obligation to stand up against speakers being shut down. And I guess I was curious because it didn't seem like the possibility was really considered in your original statement. What if faculty just disagree with you? What if faculty are exercising their freedom of speech by not speaking up in these cases?
In reference to your mentions of professors.
Okay,
let's go ahead and
sorry.
I would say, in reference to your mentions of professors at universities and Mr. DeMore at Google being fired for what some might see simply as using their freedom of expression or what have you, I would ask if the panel feels that this is equivalent to policies of many companies such as Walmart, who fire any employees who talk about unionization, and whether the rights of employees to freely organize and unionize should be protected by the First Amendment.
That's already protected by law. It's not a First Amendment matter. The law is very clear that you cannot interfere with unionization. Companies do, but that's not lawful.
The First Amendment is content neutral. You don't get First Amendment rights based on whether your content is favored. So I would hope that faculty that do understand that universities have an obligation to model civil discourse for society, because again, if we lose that, if we go to a world where brute force wins, we are moving towards anarchy. So I would hope that if students were trying to block the speech of somebody that the faculty disagreed with, whether on the right or the left, they would still say, if that person is making a reasoned argument based on evidence, that he has a right to speak. You don't get to choose who has rights of speech based on whether you agree with the content or not. Because then again, we move into a censorship position. And the assumption that's been voiced a lot today that we can trust people with power to decide what is unacceptable hate speech and what is not, I think is naive about the fact that power changes. And it has been speech that has liberated minorities in America from the appalling betrayal of our founding ideals. And free speech is really a tool for the oppressed. And that is why, again, as Steven Pinker pointed out, dictators inevitably want to silence speech to maintain their own illegitimate power.
Do you want to say anything else?
No, I'll let it go.
All right, there we go.
All right. Earlier, climate change was mentioned as an issue that's become highly politicized recently, and I want to ask the panel if there are any first steps you recommend taking to establish some sort of bipartisan foundation upon which we can productively discuss climate change and similar issues.
And over here.
So, can you hear me? All right, cool. I wanted to ask, so I would posit that social justice warrior, while a ironic and kind of like a joking term, is actually how a lot of students, like whether they admit it to themselves or not, conceive themselves and what they're doing when they walk in favor of like microaggressions as aggressive. So like social justice warrior, I would posit, is not an ironic term. So do you think that it's a failure of civil education and the producing citizens that people would kind of trivialize a very long history of toleration and dialogue in favor of righteous oppression of speech with which they don't agree, which would be microaggressions, which I would posit are not entirely valid all the time. As you said, some things might categorize, some things probably shouldn't. And so kind of in between Ms. McDonald and Mr. Dean, what do you think about the maybe failure of producing citizens who are able to take seriously their kind of responsibility to hear and then respond rather than silence?
Can I direct that to you first, Stephen, since you talked about microaggressions? Do you want to dig into that?
Let me just quickly answer the first question. This is what you get when you take them in pairs. It's essential that climate change be depoliticized. And there are a number of activists for climate change. The worst thing that happened to the movement was when Al Gore made an inconvenient truth, because he branded it a left liberal issue. And afterwards, you got the polarization by political ideology, completely independent of scientific literacy. So first of all, to the extent that we can, we need spokespeople who are not on the left to simply affirm the evidence that every climate scientist knows. So we've got to find more libertarian and right-wing people to speak about the evidence. Also, the fact of human-made climate change has to be decoupled from particular remedies. So the second worst thing that happened to the campaign to make people aware of climate change is when it was used by people like Naomi Klein as a reason that we should abolish capitalism, in part socialism. People hear that, they're going to say, okay, well, I don't believe in climate change after all. There are many ways there are a number of ways of dealing with climate change, such as a carbon tax, such as an expanded role of nuclear power, as a last resort, some kind of climate engineering. Many of these may be wise or unwise, but they should be separated from the empirical issue of whether the climate has warmed and human activity is the cause. That's my best answer to that. I'm not sure I got the question.
So I guess the question would be, do you think that the fault might not so much be that people conceive of themselves as victims, although I would maybe agree with some of that, but that we don't necessarily produce the same kind of quality of citizen who would conceive of themselves as somebody who should listen first and then respond, even if they really vehemently don't agree, that would be the conception of themselves, maybe not as a victim, but as a good citizen. And so have we done away with the latter in favor of the former?
Yeah.
Can I formulate it as deliberation? It kind of sounds like you're talking about a lack of deliberation. Does that make sense?
Sure. I guess your self-conception as somebody who would listen is sort of tied into how I would conceive the American citizen traditionally. And I think that maybe, have we lost that in your opinion? Is that the fault? Maybe not so much that people conceive of themselves as under duress all the time, instead of the responsibility to listen first, as that's how they conceive of themselves.
Yeah, certainly, I mean, we can't engineer cultural values or prestige or esteem, but to the extent that we can shift it so that being willing to listen to diverse viewpoints, being able to and willing to provide evidence and arguments for your positions, to transcend ideology and dogma, for that to be seen as a mark of prestige. That's the kind of people you really admire. That's the way we'd want to nudge the culture, but I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we ever had a golden age of the sort of deliberative democracy that we all have. Right.
We know
so
the
it's
answer to that. We
something.
didn't.
It's something that we aspire to, but again, I'm just going to repeat the speed with which the stigmatization is becoming more and more intense and insane. I mean, after Charlottesville, now the epithet du jour is no longer racist, it's white supremacist. People are being, again, Amy Wax and her colleague that wrote an op-ed that is based in social science research about how to avoid poverty, are being called white supremacists. This use of this phrase and others like it to simply silence the argument is becoming very reflexive. And again, I would say that it has its roots in an ideology of victimhood that serves as a reason for silencing speech that is portrayed as a threat, an existential threat. And I think that is maudlin and melodramatic and is a mischaracterization of what it is like to be, especially a student on an American campus, which is a position of privilege.
Thank you.
Governor?
I can't have, oh.
Just 2 quick points. On climate change, I'm not worried. Science almost always has triumphed over ignorance, so your generations, first of all, Jerry Brown is already the president of the United States when it comes to climate change. And this is going to happen. Trump really can't do that much about it. Pricing is going to have everything to do with this, the solar revolution. I mean, climate change is a done deal. We're going to fix it. And the debate is irrelevant, honestly. I mean, look, Washington is always the last place to know what the hell's going on in the rest of the country. It really is. I mean, it's middle school on steroids. They work really hard, but they have their own little culture, and they get it last. And because of the internet, which is the answer to his question, they're, instead of being 5 years behind the rest of the country, they're 15 years behind the rest of the country, and they'll figure it out eventually. By that time, all the states will have done interesting, great things. And so will Xi Jinping, who's apparently now the leader of the not-so-free world. Your question is really a big problem, because I think the reason that the discourse is so awful, one of the major reasons, is because of social media. When you actually don't have to touch somebody and face them the next morning, you can say a whole lot of things that you would never say if they lived across the hall from you. You just wouldn't. When I was in college in 1968, I had 2 African-American roommates. They had never been to school with a white person before. One was from South Carolina, the other was from Memphis. I had never been to school with a black person before because I went to a Tony prep school. And we really had it out because I did not have any white liberal guilt. And we really were like that all the time. We're today best friends. We still see each other all the time. But I can remember my roommate looking up to me in October, looking at me and saying, "We're here to learn your political science, your mathematics, and your history, and we're going to kick you in the ass with it. Welcome to freshman year." It was the most valuable year of my life because I saw things through the eyes of people that had no idea how they saw things and why. I didn't care. They wanted to kick my ass because I didn't believe them. Why didn't I believe him? Because I was sleeping in one room with one of them, and I knew how much he snored at night, and he knew how much when you get to know people like that, you see them as human beings before they fall into some other category. On social media, we categorize the hell out of everybody. And it means it's impossible for us to see the 90% of the stuff that's alike in everybody, no matter what they look like and how different they are, you think they are. This is true across national boundaries. One of the I don't call you millennials, I call you first globals because you're the first global generation. But you're the first global generation tied in on the internet, which means you don't actually have to confront somebody when you say something really awful. Now, you do travel a lot to all kinds of places that we never traveled to, and that's really great. But this key to, I think the most important thing to reestablishing civil discourse is actually to have face-to-face contact with each other and have to see things through the eyes of the other, and that really is awfully hard to do on the net.
Can I just say, with the science, I mean, with climate change, one has to believe that the facts will prevail and the reason will prevail. That's because we have open discourse in science. And we have to believe that the deniers will simply run out of arguments of the hockey stick or whatever against the evidence of year by year rising change, rising climate temperatures. So what if we had the model that we have in the humanities where the deniers could circle a meeting of climate scientists, prevent people from going in or shout them down and say that somehow these ideas violated their personal sense of worth or their existence or their right to exist. We have made scientific progress because ideas are allowed to confront each other with evidence, and I think that should be the model for non-scientific debate as well, rather than trying to, let's say again, what if the climate deniers were saying, I'm going to silence climate research? That's what's basically going on in the humanities.
Right up here. Yeah. In encouraging civil discourse, how can we acknowledge and respect that people come from varying positions of privilege without limiting or discouraging freedom of speech?
Excellent, crisp question.
Oh, okay. So my question is kind of like Chris's from before, but it's a little bit more specific, and it's from Miss McDonald. So you lamented the culture on college campuses of oppressed classes of students claiming themselves as victims. I kind of take issue with that. So now you are an affluent white woman, and I'm not saying that to discredit like your own personal experiences. Like I'm sure you've had
plenty of hardships that you've had to deal with in your life. But I think that it's important to distinguish like the difference between those hardships and the hardships, the more nuanced hardships that students that are black or students that are queer or students that are Muslim face every day. And I don't think that you, because you are not one of those classes, could ever really hope to understand those fully. So why do you feel like you can tell them whether or not they can claim themselves as victims or whether or not they can be offended?
Well, I'll take that one. There is no question that there are vast socioeconomic disparities in this country. And on college campuses, there are vast class disparities. And there are people who come from affluent backgrounds who take for granted the vacations to the Caribbean, the Florida vacations, the parents that are willing to pay their salaries, their tuition, they don't have to work. They can party if they want with a safety net of affluence at home. Those differences are real. What I am arguing against is the claim that there is systemic racism or sexism on college campuses. I am simply going to assert that I think that is a profound misreading of the faculty. And it grieves me when presidents of universities, when their students are claiming that they are under lethal threat to be at Yale or Princeton or Brown, that the presidents then apologize, because what those presidents are basically doing, if you are not going to push back against what I think is delusional, you are basically accusing your own faculty of being bigots. And if that's the case, you should name some names, because I simply don't believe that in today's age that there are faculty members who are not among the most tolerant, enlightened people in human history. Maybe 70 years ago, there were professors like that. And there probably were professors who, assumed that females weren't capable. I was in college in the 70s. I can tell you, Yale had recently gone co-ed. I was never the victim of sexism. Never. My professors wanted me to succeed, but the answer, if that is the case, as Governor Dean said, is to say, I'm going to whoop your ass. If you think I can't succeed, my revenge is going to be studying for my chemistry exam and being the first person here, whether I'm a female or an underrepresented minority. So I certainly agree that students come to college campuses with vastly different resources, economic resources. I do not think they're coming to an environment that is anything other than inclusive, and every adult wants every student to succeed.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think there are two fallacies with that line of argument. First of all, you don't know whether someone is privileged or not just because they're white or male. There are a lot of very wealthy, privileged black students. There are a lot of very poor, discriminated against white students. And so just looking at someone and say, well, you're speaking from a position of privilege is making an assumption based on their race, which may not be warranted.
I was talking about class, too.
Yeah, and class, okay. Second, whether someone is speaking from a position of privilege or not has no bearing whatsoever on the merit of their ideas. There could be people who are privileged who say things that are true. There could be people who are underprivileged who say things that are false, that are bigoted, that are racist, that are factually incorrect. So what we have to do is judge ideas based on their merit. If someone is in a position of privilege who says something that's indefensible, you can point out that the idea is indefensible. Whether they come from a position of privilege or not is completely irrelevant. They might be right, they might be wrong.
We've got a lot of other folks still waiting to keep the lines keep growing, so let's keep them going short order. Who's next? Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this panel, and I'm incredibly grateful that we do get to have this kind of civil discourse at Kenyon with 3 panelists here, because I know that not every college values different ideas in that way. But because I recognize this privilege, I think it's important for me also to know that even though Kenyon is an incredibly privileged community, not all people are on the same level of privilege. And that exists because of their gender identity, because of their sexual orientation. And I think specifically those 2 are things that aren't as discussed in regular national political discourse. But it's kind of subsidiary to my point, which is I wanted to ask, how exactly can we expect people who come from less privileged backgrounds to always feel comfortable even voicing their ideas to begin with, if they're met constantly with this idea that they are lesser, either because of microaggressions or because of very real physical threats or emotional abuse. And I think it's important that we have to recognize that not always at Kenyon do we have people from these backgrounds speaking purely because they don't feel safe to speak. And I don't think that we should exactly limit other people who come from positions of privilege. Like you said, we need to be evaluating statements based on their merit. We also need to recognize the opposite, and I'm just wondering how you think we should balance those.
I really want to give everybody a chance to ask a question. Could I ask everybody else to just state their question real quickly and then let the panel take all of them at once? Is that okay? Real quick? I know it's getting late.
You have accused people of color who have been for generations oppressed by white people.
Can you speak up more to the microphone? Sorry, thanks.
You have accused people of color who have been for generations and until today oppressed by white people of a false sense of victimhood. In that statement, I do not think you recognize your privilege as a white woman. I really don't. And I do think that it is the right of any campus students to say, no, we don't want to bring this speaker or that speaker, because they are the ones who are paying for that speaker to come. So it is their freedom of speech to say who comes to their campus and who doesn't. And one more thing, the implications of your statements that black people aren't targeted by police, they aren't killed more by police, and so on, do have real implications for people of color that I don't think you comprehend or can understand, because when you present these statements and say that people of color aren't targeted and aren't killed because of their color, for you that's just a statement, but for them that's life or death. So for us, your statements aren't just speech, they do threaten our lives. And for us, until this very day, we are still the oppressed people. For me as a Muslim international student, US drones and US bombs are the ones who are killing me and my people, and we do have real issues. And even as someone who has experienced all of that, I do recognize that what you call the false sense of victimization as a real struggle. As someone who has experienced real violence, a real threat to my life of being killed. Like a real threat.
Can we let her answer that? Okay. I think that was to Heather.
Every killing of an unarmed civilian is a stomach-churning tragedy. And given this history in this country of police brutality and the use of police force to maintain slavery and de jure segregation through brutality and unlawful excessive force, every police killing of a black man is particularly and understandably fraught. And that is a history that we rightly will never get away from, because it was so squalid and such a betrayal of our founding ideals. But this is not a debate about policing, so I don't know how much to get into the weeds on this. But I can give you the data that there is not an epidemic. There is not. Okay, 50% of all people killed by the cops each year are white. They include unarmed whites in very questionable situations.
Sorry, but more than 50% of people in the US are white, so it's not proportional. Regardless of your argument, what I'm trying to say is that your arguments have implications on our lives, real life implications. So your data has real life implications on our lives. So when we choose not to bring you to our campuses, it's not because we don't want to hear your opinion. It's not because your opinion is threatening, because people can hear it online, they can hear it wherever. It's because your opinion and the spread of your opinion results in our oppression. And this has been a historical thing. To deny our oppression historically and currently comes from a position of privilege.
Well, I would argue that the Black Lives Matter narrative has also had a real implication on minority lives, because for the homicides have gone up 20% over the last 2 years. An additional 1,800 black men have been killed since 2014. In some cities, you have homicide increases of 90%. The victims are overwhelmingly black because police are backing off from the type of proactive enforcement that citizens in high crime areas beg for. I urge you to go to police community meetings in the South Bronx or Central Harlem, and what you're going to hear from those law-abiding people here is, why aren't you clearing the corners of drug dealers and loiterers? I'm frightened to go get my mail. So that is a reality too. I am not denying that there have been bad police shootings, but there are people in high crime areas who desperately want more policing, not less. As for whether people are somehow privileged by their gender identity or unable to learn by their gender and facing real physical threats, I don't know what real physical threats there are on American campuses. I think we're speaking a metaphorical language here that then becomes used as a justification to use actual violence against people. And I don't believe that somebody's gender identity prevents them from going to the library and immersing themselves in the greatest works of civilization or in the periodic table or learning the extraordinary functioning of neurons. I think that universities make those resources available to everybody on a completely equal basis, and that the faculty want everybody to succeed.
I do feel like, unfortunately, I think we're going to need to draw it to a close here. I think those folks in line, I'd like to invite you to come up afterwards and perhaps chat with the panelists a little bit. Allow me just to thank, in the first instance, all the participants, the panelists over the last couple days, as well as all the audience, the students that have been engaging with such good questions. And then finally as well, I want to thank in a particular way Sean Decatur, Joe Klesner, Rachel Hoffman from Political Science, Andrea Leckleitner, Tim Naviska and Adam Gilson, and all our student workers that have been helping, working so hard the last couple days. Thank you all for making this possible, and thanks for coming.
That was great meeting you. Good debate.
Always a delightful pleasure.
That was terrific. Thank you. Thank you.